In this video, we're going to look at a formula for exponents. When we divide x to the nth by x to the nth, the formula says that we can keep the base x and subtract the exponents. And notice it's the top exponents m minus the bottom exponents n. First, we're going to explain how we got this formula. So we can look at an example. For example, x to the fifth divided by x squared. Before we had this formula, we are going to, if we don't know this formula, we would have to do it by definition. The definition of x to the fifth is multiplying 5 copies of x. So we're multiplying x times x times x times x. Got 5 copies of x. That's the definition of x to the fifth. And on the bottom, similarly, we're multiplying 2 copies of x because the exponent is 2. And from what we know before how to simplify fractions, the top and the bottom, if that it's the same number, we can cross them out by dividing the number itself. So the top x cancels the bottom x because they're the same number. The same variable represents the same number. So and the top x divide by the bottom x, so they are canceled out. As we can see, there's no more x that can be canceled, and we are left with a product of 3 copies of x, and we can multiply them to get x to the third. And from the process, we can see what we did actually is to cross out 2 copies of x from the top, and now we're left with 3 copies of x, and that's exactly doing 5 minus 2. So this is how we got this formula. And now we can use the formula to do this problem. So after we memorize the formula, we don't have to do it by definition anymore because it's very tedious. We have to write down many copies of x. So let's use the formula to do this question. So when we do division, as we know, we can only divide a number by number, a variable by variable, the same with the same base. Notice in the formula, the base x has to be the same. If they're different, we won't be able to cross out this x, as we know that they have to be the same number in order to be crossed out. So if the top has x, y, bottom has y, we won't be able to cross them out. So both top and bottom have to be the same variable x. So now we can look at how to do this question. So we're going to do 15 divided by negative 5, which gives us a negative 3. Pay attention to the minus sign. Positive divided by negative is negative. Now we divide x to the 6th by x. And notice x doesn't have exponent here, but we need to remember it means x to the first, because x, it means we have 1 copy of x. So that's the same as x to the first. So we're going to use the formula to do it. 6 minus 1. Top exponent 6 minus the bottom exponent 1. Keeping the base x. So we get x to the 5th. Similarly for y, we're going to do keep the variable y and take the top exponent 7 minus the bottom exponent 4. That gives us a 3. But for the last case, if we use the formula, we know that 2 minus 2 is 0. So we're going to get a z to 0. But what is z to 0? 0 copies of z, which means there's no z. So we should do one more step to write down the simplified form of z to the 0. Well, z to the 0, there's no 0 copy of z, which means it's going to be a number, not a variable, and no z anymore. So that actually z to the 0 is equal to 1. Why is z to the 0 equal to 1? Because when we do this, we can do it by definition. As we know, the top has 2 copies of z, which is z times z. And the bottom also has 2 copies of z, z times z. Now we can cross out the same variable, the same number. Z cancels z. Z cancels z. So we're left with nothing, but it's not really nothing. It's actually 1 over 1, because z divided by z, a number divided by itself, it's 1. z divided by z is 1. So we're going to get 1 divided by 1, that is 1. So when we do the question, if we use the formula, we get a z to the 0. But if we do it by definition, we get 1. So that tells us z to the 0 has to be equal to 1. And we can continue to write down one more step. Negative 3 times 1 is negative 3. And we keep the variables x to the 5th and y to the 3rd. So if the top and the bottom has the same variable, same exponents and the variable, we can go ahead and cross them out, which is the easiest way to do the question, because anything divided by itself is equal to 1.